First, let me say how disappointed I am in Prime Minister Trudeau, and he should know better and act better. By the way, he's very disappointed in me, too. I pointed out some of the limitations of the United States in a meeting, and he was furious with me. So I will reciprocate the frustration. He should know better, but he has signed on, let's say, to the U.S. agenda. And I always considered Canada the sane part of North America. That's a little unfair to Mexico, because Mexico's technically also North America, but of the two countries, I'm a Detroiter originally, so I always viewed Canada as my southern neighbor because we drove south from Detroit to get to Windsor. But let me just say, I always admired Canada as being kinder, gentler, more rational. And I'm still hoping for something better because Canada really can do better. And Canadian society, thank God, doesn't have the disasters the United States society has, because it is a kinder, gentler country. But the policies are, there's a large Ukrainian emigre community. It's a powerful voting group. But the big misunderstanding is sending NATO to Ukraine is no friend to Ukraine. It's the biggest disaster. I mean, all of this war is the biggest disaster possible. That's what I tried to explain to my Ukrainian friends for years. Don't get into the middle of a proxy war of the United States. It destroys you. And that's what's happening to Ukraine. So I'm not against Ukraine. I'm trying to save Ukraine, not the way that the United States does it. The United States, quote, claimed to want to save Afghanistan. Well, there you have proof positive of what it means when the United States wants to save you. Please don't try that at home. It's really not a good idea. What I meant specifically about the vote, yes, if there's a vote, it'll pass if there's no public debate. But if there is a real public debate, and so this has procedures that it goes through both, it goes through committees in the House. There are witnesses. You testify. I testify. We bring people to Washington. We have an expression of the will of the American people. There's a good chance. And even I'm waiting for Rand Paul and others to just get 40 votes in the U.S. Senate, which would stop this as well. So I think that if this were ever democratized, we would actually have a real chance. The American people do not want this war. This is absolutely clear. And I think that, but they don't give us the chance for that kind of public debate. The U.S. is against neutrality because NATO is U.S. power. That's the basic idea. That is the neocon idea. They call it liberal hegemony. It's a ridiculous idea. But that has been the idea since 1992. And it's deep. As I explained, it's bipartisan. It's basically owned by the military-industrial complex. Victoria Nuland is probably the single best illustration of the deep state aspect of this, because in the early 1990s, or actually in the early 2000s, she was Cheney's security advisor. That's not a good start, by the way. The man who brought us multiple disasters. Then she became, under Bush Jr., the U.S. ambassador to NATO, during 2005 to 2008. So she was a key point person in the commitment of NATO to enlarge. Then she became Hillary Clinton's spokesperson. You see, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. Then she became Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. And she was the person who coordinated the U.S. on the Maidan. And she's the one on the phone call, the fuck Europe phone call. Excuse her language. It's not my language. She's the one on that phone call. Then she's now Undersecretary of State. So this is both parties. This is continuity. This is a strategy. Why does NATO propose to open an office in Japan now? Really? Is NATO the U.S. expeditionary force for the upcoming Taiwan War? What could they conceivably be thinking? Why did the U.S. insist on inviting 4 Asia-Pacific leaders to NATO? Because they have no sense. Because they are looking towards a global war. So why they do this, I think it is what William Fulbright 60 years ago entitled a great book which people should read, The Arrogance of Power. They are drunk with power. And that's what this is about. And they don't know better. They're out of control.
So I have several questions on.
Let me just a quick.
Sorry for that.
Yeah, just to say.
The protests on the streets.
Yeah. So
basic rights.
Yeah. So the Vatican, unfortunately, was a little outside the Vatican because the Pope had surgery last weekend, it turned out, in the end. And thank goodness he's recovering very well. But we had an event at the auditorium Ara Pacis, which is the altar of peace under Augustus, just next to the Augustus mausoleum, just across the Tiber from the Vatican. And it was the 60th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's peace speech. And that is a speech I would recommend that everybody listen to again and again. I've made my family listen to it I don't know how many times, but it's the greatest speech by an American leader in modern history. And he gave it 60 years ago, June 10, 1963. And we celebrated that by bringing together Carrie Kennedy, President Kennedy's niece, and Robert Kennedy's daughter, and Nina Khrushcheva, the granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, and Gillian Sorensen, the widow of Theodore Sorensen, who wrote the speech together with President Kennedy. So it was a wonderful occasion. And that speech was a speech at the height of the Cold War, telling the American people we can negotiate peace with the Soviet Union. It was extraordinarily brave, extraordinarily beautiful, extraordinarily wise, and it led to the partial nuclear test ban treaty 5 weeks after President Kennedy gave the speech. And the speech is filled with wisdom that we should take into account. One of the parts of the speech that we should take into account, and let me read you just this excerpt to get it exactly right, because it is extremely important for our survival. If I can find it, there it is. Above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. So he said, don't put an adversary at the choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. Well, what is our goal every day? We must defeat Russia. We must humiliate Russia. We must teach Russia a lesson. President Kennedy didn't just say, don't do that. In this long and wonderful speech, he says, above all, we must avoid that. He knew what he was talking about. It was 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which nearly ended the world. So above all, we shouldn't be doing precisely what we're doing right now. President Biden should not be taunting Vladimir Putin. The number of times the word humiliating is put with delight in the English language press is really impressive. Russia's humiliation, Russia's humiliation. So what we're doing is exactly the opposite of what President Kennedy urged and what President Kennedy proved could actually lead to peace. So that's what we did in Rome last week.